Good morning everyone, this is Dr. Shaima, and today's class we are dealing with hypothalamus as a continuation of the central nervous system. Hypothalamus, exam point of view, it's a very often asked 10 marker, and you need to be really thorough with the different nuclear group in hypothalamus, the efferent and the efferent connections of hypothalamus, and also most importantly the different functions of hypothalamus. So let's go in detail into the chapter. So basically hypothalamus, if you look at it, it's a very small structure, and it's actually composed of many small nuclei which carries out varied diverse functions in the body. And if you look at the location of hypothalamus, it's located above the midbrain but just below the thalamus. And I think you all should be aware that the hypothalamus makes up the ventral part of the diencephalon. So diencephalon basically includes the hypothalamus, thalamus, and also the subthalamus. And it's basically hypothalamus is an essential component for the regulation of many homeostatic functions in your body, the visceral functions, the body functions like sleep, wakefulness, circadian rhythms, many reproductive functions are all functions of hypothalamus. And it's able to manage these many functions in the body because of its widespread connections with many other, it works in an integrated way, or it's an integrating center in the brain. It's also it's connected with the pituitary gland, and through the connection with the pituitary gland, it controls the major endocrine and the reproductive functions in the body. And through the connections of hypothalamus with brain stem, it controls the autonomic functions, the thermoregulatory function, the cardiovascular and the respiratory functions in the body. And it is connected even through the limbic system, and through its connections with the limbic system, it controls the behavior of a human being. And through hypothalamus is also connected to the cortical areas, and by its connection to the cortical areas, it controls the higher functions of the brain, including the learning and the memory. So the basic three important functions of hypothalamus is executed through the limbic system, where it controls the behavior and the emotions of a human being. The autonomic nervous system, the major control is by the hypothalamus, and also the endocrinal functions. The higher and all this hypothalamus is able to do through its efferent and efferent connections to different centers of the brain, and that's exactly the reason why we call it as a major integrating center of the brain. Now this figure shows you a mid-sagittal section through the brain, showing the most prominent components. So in this you can actually see the the extent of the hypothalamus. Basically hypothalamus is a very small structure in the brain, and it lies on each side of the third ventricle, and its weight is just about 10 grams. It's located just below the thalamus, and that's exactly why it is called as the hypothalamus. Now this thalamus and subthalamus together, it forms a diencephalon. We have already discussed that in the previous slide. And I've already told you that hypothalamus is basically a collection of large number of nuclei and nuclear groups. So this is about the major functions of hypothalamus, which I've already summarized as I was doing the introduction with the first slide. You can see that hypothalamus, it synthesizes and it also secretes neurohormones into the circulation. It basically acts as a conduit between the nervous system and the endocrine system, which happens via the pituitary gland or the hypophysis. Now the regulation of all the homeostatic functions such as thirst, hunger, body temperature and circadian rhythms are also controlled by the hypothalamus. Now here in this picture you can see the hypothalamus and its major nuclei and the nuclear groups. So basically if you look at the nuclei, you can have a careful look at the picture. I'll just explain about the classification of the hypothalamus and its nuclei group. Hypothalamus, it comprises of 4 main nuclear groups. So that's 4 major divisions. You have the anterior, you have the middle, you have the posterior and the lateral groups. So let's see which are the nuclear groups which are put under these 4 categories. Few of them belongs to the anterior group, then the middle group, the posterior group and the lateral group. This is how the hypothalamic nuclei groups are divided. Now in the anterior groups, you can see it in the picture. The anterior group, it includes the preoptic, supraoptic and the paraventricular nuclei. Now the middle group, it includes the tuberal, arcuate, ventromedial and the dorsomedial nuclei. Next is the posterior group. Now the posterior group contains the supramammillary, mammillary and the posterior hypothalamic nuclei. And finally you have the lateral group, which comprises of the lateral preoptic area and the lateral hypothalamic area. I think you need to be really thorough with this 4 divisions of the nuclear group of hypothalamus: the anterior group, the middle group, the posterior group and the lateral group, and what each group contains, or which is the group. For example, the anterior group contains the preoptic, supraoptic and the paraventricular nuclei. Middle group contains the arcuate, ventromedial, tuberal and the dorsomedial nuclei. The posterior group consists of the supramammillary, mammillary and the posterior hypothalamic nuclei, and finally the lateral group, it comprises of the lateral preoptic area and the lateral hypothalamic area. So that's about the hypothalamic and its different nuclear group or collections, and all of them, they do diverse varied functions in the body. Now let's go to the functions of hypothalamus. The functions of hypothalamus is divided into around 10. So first function is controls the autonomic nervous system. Then you have, it's basically the center for regulation of body temperature. It regulates the water balance in the body. It's neurosecretory in function. It controls the sexual functions in the body. Appetite, hunger and feeding is also controlled. Emotional behavior and emotional exteriorization is also a function of hypothalamus. Hypothalamus influences sleep. It helps in in stress management, and finally the biological rhythms or the circadian rhythms are also maintained by the hypothalamus. So these are the 10 functions of hypothalamus which you all need to know at the tip of your tongue, all the 10 functions. So now let's go into detail of each functions. First, let's see how hypothalamus controls the autonomic nervous system. Now in general, if you look at the stimulation of the lateral and the posterior hypothalamic areas results in sympathetic response. That means the posterior and the lateral nuclei of the hypothalamus are actually the sympathetic center, because when you try to stimulate the lateral and the posterior hypothalamic areas, it will cause changes in different systems or parameters in the body, which is directly influenced by the sympathetic nervous system. And Sherrington, the scientist, had called hypothalamus as the head ganglion, because the reason is through different experiments and studies, Sherrington was the first to know that hypothalamus has got a very strong influence on the autonomic nervous system, and because of its close link with the autonomic functions, the scientist Sherrington has described hypothalamus as the head ganglion of autonomic nervous system. Now whenever you try to electrically stimulate this posterior and the lateral nuclei of hypothalamus, the changes which happens in the body, there is cardiac acceleration, vasoconstriction happens in the body, blood pressure is raised, the pupils dilate, there is piloerection, adrenaline is released, there is inhibition of gastrointestinal movements and also the urinary bladder movements. So all this are very characteristic to the changes happening in the body when the sympathetic nervous system is stimulated. So exactly why we know that the posterior and the lateral nuclei of the hypothalamus are called as the sympathetic centers, because when you electrically stimulate them, all these many around 7 changes happens in the body. Now let's see, about the parasympathetic nervous system. Now the parasympathetic control is when you stimulate the anterior hypothalamus. So when the anterior portion of the hypothalamus is stimulated, the changes happening in the body will be very similar to the parasympathetic stimulated changes. So like with sympathetic nervous system, you tell that there are no specific parasympathetic centers, but whenever the anterior portion of the hypothalamus is stimulated, there is parasympathetic stimulation happening in the body. So anterior portion, so exactly if you have to put down the name, it's like when the preoptic center is electrically stimulated, there is an increase in the gastrointestinal movement and also the urinary bladder contraction. Cardiac inhibition is there, then sweating is there. Now, when you stimulate the middle group of the nuclei, it activates the peripheral nervous system. So, when you look at, when the previous one, when the posterior and the lateral nuclei are stimulated, the changes happening like rise in blood pressure, vasoconstriction, cardiac acceleration. But here when you see when the anterior portion of the preoptic center is stimulated, exactly the opposite changes are happening here. And one more thing to be remembered here is when the middle group of the nuclei of hypothalamus is stimulated, there is activation of the peripheral nervous system also. Now the next important function of hypothalamus is the body temperature regulation. Regulation of body temperature basically depends on the balance between the mechanisms that controls heat loss and heat gain. Many central mechanisms and also peripheral mechanisms play a very crucial role in temperature mechanism. But now here, so basically for temperature regulation in the body, peripheral mechanisms and the central mechanisms need to work hand in hand. Now the central mechanism maintenance, hypothalamus plays a very important role. Now the center for heat loss is the anterior nuclei in the hypothalamus, and whenever the anterior nuclei is stimulated, there is vasodilation, sweating. Now the center for heat gain is the posterior nuclei. You shouldn't get confused there. Heat gain center is the posterior nuclei, and whenever you stimulate the posterior nuclei, you can see vasoconstriction happening in the person, there is shivering. And now in an experimental setup, when the hypothalamus is removed, then what happens is you call the animal as the poikilothermic. That means normal body temperature cannot be maintained when the hypothalamus is removed in an experimental animal. So center for heat loss is the anterior nuclei and the posterior nuclei is the center for heat gain. So whenever those centers are stimulated, you can see the changes happening accordingly where heat loss needs to happen, or vice versa when heat gain needs to happen. And when hypothalamus is removed experimentally, the particular animal cannot maintain the body temperature. Now let's see the next most important part, how hypothalamus is the third center, isn't it? So how hypothalamus maintains water balance. So hypothalamus secretes ADH, antidiuretic hormone, which actually helps in the reabsorption of water from the renal tubules. Now osmoreceptors are present in the supraoptic nuclei, which actually controls the extracellular fluid osmolality. Now this water loss combined with dehydration, water deprivation leads to osmolarity increase. Now whenever this antidiuretic hormone is released, water reabsorption from the collecting tubules is increased, activating thirst center, and the center is the lateral hypothalamus. And this all happens by stimulation of intracellular dehydration. So this is about how water balance is maintained or happens with hypothalamus. Now let's go to the next function, which is a neurosecretory function. I told you one of the major function of hypothalamus is endocrine function, along with how it works hand in hand with the limbic system and also the autonomic nervous system. Hypothalamus, if you look at, it synthesizes a number of hormones in the body. Posterior pituitary hormones like ADH, antidiuretic hormone, and oxytocin. Neurosecretory cells which are present in the supraortic and the PV nucleus. Now they travel via the hypothalamo-hypophyseal fibers and they get stored in the posterior pituitary. Now by releasing and inhibiting hormones, the neurosecretory cells of the hypothalamus, which is a median eminence, it reaches the pituitary via the hypothalamo-hypophyseal portal circulation, and all these get stored in the anterior pituitary. So this is in brief about the neurosecretory functions of hypothalamus. Now the neurosecretory mechanism happens or there is something like a neuroendocrine regulatory mechanism which happens in the body. Now the secretion is adjusted to the needs of the changing external and also the internal environment. Growth hormone releasing and inhibiting hormone is released, corticotropin releasing hormone is released, thyrotropin releasing hormone, gonadotropin releasing hormone, luteinizing hormone releasing hormone, prolactin releasing and inhibiting hormone. These are all hormones which are released by the hypothalamus, and that's exactly why the hormonal regulation or the control by the hypothalamus is very, very important, because either by releasing or inhibiting the release of certain hormones, hypothalamus controls the endocrine functions of the body. Now let's have a look at how the sexual functions in the body are controlled by the hypothalamus. Now the sexual functions are mainly controlled by the release of the gonadotropin releasing hormone by the hypothalamus. Now when the GnRH is released, it actually influences the onset of puberty, gametogenesis, ovulation in females, regulation and secretion of gonadal hormones. Now along with the limbic lobe, in association with limbic lobe, hypothalamus does many functions. So now the function hypothalamus does in relation to the limbic lobe regarding sexual function is it influences the sexual behavior. Now whenever hypothalamus is stimulated, it increases the sex drive of the person. Now when there is a lesion present, or when a lesion is created in an experimental monkey in the hypothalamus, it's observed that there is a decrease in sex drive when the hypothalamus a lesion is produced. Now the next you have the very important function where hypothalamus controls the hunger and appetite. Now feeding center in your body is the lateral hypothalamus, and the satiety center is the ventromedial nucleus. Now when the feeding center or the lateral hypothalamus is increasingly stimulated, that results in excessive eating. And now when the ventromedial nucleus is stimulated, it causes the cessation of feeding. Now when a destruction of the feeding center happens, then the situation which the experimental animal or the person results in, we call it as anorexia, where the person or the animal starves to death. If the satiety center, the ventromedial nucleus, is destroyed, then there is something called as a voracious appetite, where the person continuously eats, there is excessive eating, and finally it results in hypothalamic obesity. Now the next most important function of hypothalamus is its influence on sleep. Now the stimulation of different parts of the hypothalamus at very low frequency. Now the posterior hypothalamic region, which receives inputs from the preoptic and the suprachiasmatic region, produces sleep. Now the existence of sleep center. Now when the intralaminar and the anterior thalamic nuclei are stimulated, it induces sleep, the diencephalic sleep zone. Now when the lesion happens with the suprachiasmatic nucleus of the anterior hypothalamus, there is prolonged wakefulness which happens on the person. Now This is a general brief up about, the influence of sleep when the hypothalamus centers are stimulated. So now let's see what is the relation of hypothalamus to stress. Stress is through the release of a hormone, the corticotropin releasing hormone. So when there is release of or because of stress, there is a release of corticotropin releasing hormone. So now that leads to an increased glucocorticoid secretion. So basically an increased glucocorticoid secretion is a response of a body to an increased stress. Now maintaining circadian rhythm is also done by the hypothalamus. Now what do you mean by the circadian rhythm? Circadian rhythm means 24 hours fluctuations in the body functions, that is a day and night variation or variation during light dark cycle. Many body functions show a circadian pattern. Some of these important functions which you can think about is your sleep habit, corticosteroid secretion, any body temperature variation, melatonin secretion, all these are actually belongs to the category of circadian rhythm, and most of these circadian functions are regulated by the hypothalamus. So the hypothalamic nuclei which regulates and maintains the circadian rhythmicity is the suprachiasmatic nucleus. So this SCN or the suprachiasmatic nucleus we call as the biological clock. So you need to keep that in mind. That's a very often asked Viva question. Now the circadian rhythms can be physical, mental, and any behavioral changes that follows a daily cycle. Now they respond primarily to light and darkness in the organism's environment, and circadian rhythm is present in most of the cells of the body. Liver, which influenced by the food intake pattern. Now the other cells, the rhythm is synchronized by the suprachiasmatic nuclei which is located on either side of the optic chiasma. So basically what you need to keep in mind is the hypothalamus, the nucleus in the hypothalamus which is regulating and maintaining the circadian rhythmicity is the suprachiasmatic nuclei, which you also call as the biological clock. So I think we have a few more slides to go to finish hypothalamus. I think today's class I would like to stop here. So I would want you all to tomorrow when I come for the class, I want you all to be really thorough with what have been done in today's class, so that the coming up classes you all have a better understanding. Please keep in mind hypothalamus is 100% asked question either as a 10 marker, or they'll pick up and ask one of these functions as a 5 marker or a 3 marker. So I've normally observed always a question on hypothalamus comes in central nervous system. So hope you all are making your notes, listening to the lecture. Please study well. See you tomorrow in the next class. Thank you.